we needn't let self-development for men with the goal of being a better partner and achieving romantic success automatically equate to misogyny. Because if you don't have anything to say on that very important thing to young men, Andrew Tate has plenty to say, and they will flock to him, right? So if you have to provide some sort of alternative.
I'll be the first to admit it. I've tended to talk about incels as either being threatening, aggressive, hostile, misogynistic, or as being objects of disdain. And that's quite a callous way and a really reductive way to talk about people who are experiencing loneliness and a lack of connection with others. And I do genuinely believe that journalists and human beings more generally should try to be motivated by curiosity and empathy. So for a while now, I've wanted to do a Downstream about the subject of incels with an expert in the field. And at last, that day has arrived. I'm joined by William Costello, PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, and author of some of the most extensive and serious research on the psychology of incels that there is out there. There are some things that we disagree on, as you'll see, but there are some facts in his work that are deserving of proper attention. In William Costello's research, 30% of his sample of incels met the diagnostic criteria for autism. Just to be clear, no one is saying that people with autism are more violent or more misogynistic than the rest of the population at large. But what William Costello's research looks at is the way in which autism makes men more vulnerable to incel ideology and the bi-directional relationship between poor mental well-being and incel ideology. We talk about dating on the apps, the ingredients of a healthy relationship, and what straight women really want from men. I hope you enjoy the interview. So this wasn't actually how I wanted to start at all. But what is it with men's sneezes? Like, is it like competitive to sneeze like you're trying to blow out the windows in the house?
Interesting. I feel I'm not sex typical in that regard then, because I sneeze very muted. I kind of
you
keep
have
it
a
all
petite sneeze.
Yes, a very effeminate sneeze. So,
because my partner's not a domineering person at all, but his sneeze is like a demon is trying to escape from him.
I've noticed that too. Kind of annoys me as well, but I have no explanation.
No explanation.
I'm not aware of the research on that sneezing.
Okay, well, maybe that can be your next PhD.
Yes. Even more obscure of a topic than my actual one.
I mean, I think that like the incel thing's kind of populist, but we can get into that. I mean, before we get started on your actual area of research, first, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And secondly, because I noticed you tweeted about it a little bit, what's your take on the Kendrick Lamar-Drake rap beef?
Interesting. I was talking to another master's student of evolutionary psychology. She goes to Brunel here in London, where I did my master's. And she's a very smart lady. And she kind of often analyzes the psychology of like modern rap music. And she noticed that the kind of derogation tactics that modern rappers are now derogating fathering qualities, which is so interesting. Like that's kind of a million miles away from how rappers used to derogate each other in the 90s, let's say. It wouldn't be about, oh, you're a bad dad. That was not a kind of insult.
It was much more like, you know, I fucked your wife.
Right, kind of more, hostile aggression. But she suggests that maybe fathering qualities are becoming more important, given that modern women are earning their own money and kind of, doing their own thing on that front. So then other qualities become more salient. And that fits with some other research. I'm writing a paper with a guy called Mac and Murphy about how over recent decades, physical attractiveness has become more and more important to women in their reports of what they say and how much they value physical attractiveness. But also there's converging lines of evidence, like every man in his 20s to 30s is a recreational bodybuilder, right? We all go to the gym, like kind of that's incredibly exploded since the 80s. Men are starting to use makeup, caring way more about their image in terms of fashion. Body dysmorphia is rapidly increasing in men and actually on track to overtake women's body dysmorphia in the next decade, which is really surprising. And that's largely driven by the gym bro kind of body dysmorphia culture of not getting as many gains as you think you need.
So I introduced my husband to moisturizing, but at what cost?
Right, yeah. Well, that's the direction of travel. Yeah, it's we're going to call the paper the ape that evolved into a peacock. So it's kind of like humans are typically a reversal of many species, whereby take the peacock, for example. The peahen is very drab and not very bright, whereas the peacock is very exuberant, the male, and the female peahen selects for the brightest plumage, whereas in humans, it's the female that puts the emphasis on physical attractiveness. So that might be coming back into equilibrium now, given that women are earning their own resources and kind of taking care of themselves on that front. When they're free of having to select men to provision them with resources, they'll select prettier men, which is interesting.
I mean, I think going back to the Drake-Kendrick thing, because one, I'm a rap obsessive, and two, whenever you have a pop cultural moment where everyone's talking about it, I'm just so happy. I'm just so happy. And I read that tweet about the sort of denigration of Drake's, fathering abilities, and linking it to the idea that that's what women are looking for, so it's more valuable. And I think I disagreed with it. And I think I disagreed with why it was being denigrated in the way that it was. Because the person who got that started was Pusha T with the story of Adidon, where he did this big reveal of Drake's hiding a child. And everyone focused on the "you're hiding a child" bit, but what they missed was the way in which he connected it to Drake's own experiences of being parented. So really the narrative is you're screamingly inauthentic and you don't know who you are because your father was a deadbeat and now you're repeating the pattern. And same with Kendrick Lamar, it's like you're inauthentic, you just bite other people's styles, which has always been a component of rap beef, this idea that you're fake. It's just... Nas and Jay-Z had that, like Tupac and Biggie had that. But again, connecting it to his experience of being parented. And I wonder if it's less about what do women find attractive and more about how the art form has really honed its ability to psychologically dismantle someone in a way which owes a little bit more to psychoanalysis and a little bit less to evolutionary psychology.
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, I immediately kind of think the more parsimonious explanation is the derogating around mating qualities. So, for example, most of the ways in which men and women denigrate each other are linked to sexual mate value characteristics. So, for example, women typically denigrate other women's promiscuity, whereas men typically denigrate formidability and sexuality. They kind of question their sexuality. So I think that might be more of what's going on, but interesting take about the psychoanalysis, but that's, not my terrain.
To go onto your terrain, what made you study the psychology of incels? How did that begin? I
come from an evolutionary psychology background, and we focus a lot on human mating psychology, which I think is important to investigate because we're a sexually reproducing species. Every human being alive on planet Earth today is here because an unbroken chain of ancestors solved the problem of mating to reproduce.
Not me, I just hatched fully formed under a moist rock.
You just materialized. Very good. It's hugely important to humans. It's a fundamental human drive. We build billion-dollar industries around it in dating apps, cosmetic surgery to look more attractive. We write poetry over mating. We go to war over mates. So it's really important to humans. So to think that there's this group of modern young men who see themselves outside of accessing that at all, I was very interested to see the effects on themselves and what effects that would bring about in terms of their attitudes towards others. Some people say to me, well, why do incels care so much about sexual and romantic relationships? And I'm like, why does anyone? I mean, everyone cares. That's like the number one concern for a lot of people. It's a tall order to simply ask incels, have you considered just simply not caring about this massively important thing? I guess you could try to direct them to focusing on cultivating relationships more broadly, which is important because they do retreat from society and don't have friends, and it's a broader loneliness issue. But I don't demean the social pain of feeling sexually invisible. That is a real social pain to me. Like some of the most rich, conscious experiences available to humans are your romantic relationships and the prospect of them. So feeling like you're outside of that was a kind of an interesting thing to analyze for me. And then on the other side of things, I thought it was like the sweet spot of a research topic because there was lots of media attention, lots of government attention, lots of worry about this topic, but not a lot of research. So at the time I started, I was one of the few studies to have primary responses from incels at all. It's growing now, but still very much in its infancy. And it's proven a good research topic of choice so far. Yeah.
I mean, it's important to distinguish this. When we're talking about incels, are we talking about people who, for whatever reason, are unable to have the kinds of sexual and romantic relationships that they would like to have? Or are we talking about an ideological group that's very online? We're talking about men. We're talking about predominantly white men. We're talking about people who are, kind of far right or far right adjacent. Like, how are we using this language?
Yeah, I think the identity piece is very important because it's objectively impossible to prove that someone can't form a sexual or romantic relationship. And yeah, we're looking at people who come to identify with this factor of their circumstance. They come to form an identity around their perceived inability to form sexual or romantic relationships and engage in this kind of ideological behavior. I would push back on some of the points you just made there about them being a predominantly white, right-wing group, because some of our findings directly refute that. Actually, there's disproportionately people of color in the incel community. And in terms of their politics, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. And the media caricature of them as angry young white men is not actually right. And there is racism in the incel community, but it's very different in kind to a white supremacist group. It's very much more self-loathing. They complain about racism in the dating market, which seems a very unusual move for a white supremacist group to do. And there is some other racial tropes that they have about the dating market. For example, they encourage C-maxing, SEA maxing, which stands for Southeast Asia maxing, which is the idea that white men could move to Southeast Asia and improve their romantic prospects. Things like that could be arguably considered really racially charged. But do you see what I mean? It's a very different thing to we're supremacist. They more just complain about how racist they see the dating market as being, which is interesting.
I mean, just to go back to this sort of like distinction. So is your interest primarily people who identify themselves as incels and participate in some kind of incel community, like an online incel community? Is that what you're looking at?
Yes, primarily we're interested in the subculture, people who identify as incel. That's the question we ask from our participants and who we analyze. In other research, I've looked at, or I've been on a team of researchers who look at involuntary singlehood. And there's some other research that has investigated just the characteristic of unwanted celibacy. And interestingly, unwanted celibacy predicts misogynistic attitudes in incels and non-incels alike. So there is a lot of commonalities to the psychology of, and we also know from other research that feeling like your low mate value is a strong predictor of misogyny as well. Men are most inclined towards misogyny when they doubt their appeal to female partners. And so there's a lot of overlaps even, but primarily our research is focused on the subculture, individuals who come to identify with this predicament, and it forms their identity.
I mean, I want to come back to this question of misogyny and perceived low mate value. But just to go back to the incel subculture for a second, what are the kinds of character traits and demographic indicators which are predominant within the incel subculture?
Okay, so in terms of demographics, like I said, there were disproportionately people of color. So our recent data, which is the largest incel study in the world, was exclusively US and UK sample, and 42% were a person of color. So that's disproportionately incels of color. They're very likely to be on low education, low employment, highly likely to be neat, so not in education, employment, or training. They are score very poorly on mental health measures, so extreme levels of depression, anxiety, loneliness. They score very high on a personality trait called the tendency for interpersonal victimhood, and that very much describes the incel mindset. So incels buy into the philosophy of the black pill, which is a derivative of the concept of the red pill from the movie The Matrix, which describes seeing reality as it really is compared to the blissful ignorance of the blue pill. The black pill for incels describes what they see as a particularly bleak truth, that there was no chance for them ever in romantic relationships, and they should accept that it's over and lay down and rot. This is their kind of language. Very, very extreme nihilism.
There's the stuff about like hope, cope, or rope.
Yes, so that kind of is the three categories that incels describe you can fall into. One is the hopers still engage in things like looks maxing, trying to actually change their mate value and trying to improve their predicament. And then there's cope, so people who are maybe deluding themselves about how to cultivate a meaningful life, and incels kind of derogate that. They denigrate anyone with any sort of optimism. And then rope is unfortunately refers to the high levels of suicidality that we find among incels, which is really, really bleak. So in our latest data, 1/5 of incels said they thought about suicide every day over the last 2 weeks. And that is like extraordinarily high compared to other groups of similar age.
How much higher?
So I think my colleague sent me the stat this morning. I think it's like more. I think 4% of typical young men think about suicide every day or have had suicidal thoughts over the last year, actually. So it's extraordinarily high. Yeah.
And one of the things that you've written about is that incel culture is perceived as a crisis of violence, whereas in reality, you're talking about it as a crisis of suicide.
Yeah, so I think the data seem to suggest that one of the primary risk factors from incels is this high level of suicidality. And that fits with a lot of data because we know from previous work that two of the biggest predictors of male suicidal ideation are failures in mating and feeling like you're a burden on your kin. So incels fit both of those criteria very saliently. So they're obviously failing in their mating goals, but they're also very likely to live with their parents into adulthood and be underemployed at low levels of employment. So that feeling like burdensomeness to kin is salient for incels too. In terms of the risk factor from incels, I think we need to maybe contextualize it a little bit different because incels have been presented as the new terrorist group threat. And they're very, very different from other terrorist groups in terms of their levels of violence and just in terms of how organized they are. So they're not very organized or in agreement about a collective end goal to engage in political violence for. So in that sense, they're very, very different from any terrorist group. They're not very mobilized offline in any way. There's not strong evidence to suggest they meet each other offline at all, but hardly ever compared to other groups. So the way I would characterize the group level threat is, have you ever seen the new Batman movie with the Riddler?
Yes.
So basically the plot line, spoiler alert for listeners,
is that there's an opera singing madman on the loose.
Right. And he mobilizes a kind of anon group of terrorists to do his bidding, basically incels. And that to me, from like a terrorism studies perspective, seems like a logistical nightmare. Like like organizing terrorism is a serious logistics operation, right? So mobilizing a low motivation group of anons on the internet who don't know who each other are, it's not very likely. But by the same token, sexless young men typically throughout history, throughout time, have been the group to worry about. So strongly associated with violence that we call it the young male syndrome in our field, that this has always been a huge problem. Now, throughout history, you had kind of cultural or social institutions to deal with your population of incels. So, for example, the monastery would be one for sure, give a high status position to kind of channel these extra guys into. You'd create Vikings out of them. The Vikings were likely incels, not the sexy kind of Netflix Vikings that you think from the TV shows. The Portuguese explorers, there's strong evidence that they were incels, basically, sent on purpose missions to kind of basically get away from causing trouble for everyone else.
I mean, can you define them as incels when sexual violence was a part of that conquest?
Right. So that's also a good point, that the motivation of acquiring mates has been a motivating factor for a lot of men to join terrorist groups. Even jihadi violence, it's the promise of brides in this life or the next. And when you talk to anthropologists who, there's one, Napoleon Chagnon, and he did some research with the Yanomamo, who are an extremely violent hunter-gatherer society in Bolivia. And he told them about why people in the West go to war to spread democracy, free speech, things like this. And they were just falling off their chair laughing. They were like, what? Why would you? And he said, well, why do you go to war? And they were like, only one reason, to get mates. Like that was like a number one kind of motivating factor. So while incels as a group aren't this organized terrorist group, the potential for those individuals who fit that profile, a sexless, purposeless kind of young man, that is the prime candidate to mobilize into violence. And there is the potential for each individual incel with their extremely poor mental health to kind of lash out at society, and when they feel so discluded from society and don't value their own life, they kind of could lash out at others in acts of violence. Kind of suicide by cop kind of thing has been typical of even the high profile acts of violence. But to put the incel violence into scale, there's been about 59 people killed in acts of violence from incels. 10 of those can be attributed to one guy, Alec Manassian, alone. So given that sexlessness is kind of rising among young men, we're not seeing this overall spike in violence that we might expect. And actually, given what we know about young male syndrome, it's actually a bit of a puzzle that incels aren't more violent. My supervisor and I published a paper on this last year saying, why isn't there more incel violence? And we propose a speculative hypothesis that maybe the internet is kind of sedating modern young men. So in the past, we had the monastery, Vikings, raids, other institutions to deal with incels. Now we might just have the internet, and they channel their aggression there. Pornography gives them just enough of a cue that they're not an evolutionary dead end. It's kind of like a counterfeit fitness cue. So that might be what's going on, or just simply they might be distracted by the internet. And the aggression and the misogyny is awful on the internet, but for the most part, it's channeled into these echo chamber forums that if you choose to look at it, it's awful. It's very performatively gross, designed to be as abhorrent and repugnant as possible. But it's largely channeled into these kind of echo chambers talking to each other kind of thing.
Unless you're a woman with a public profile on the internet, particularly if you're one that's perceived as a feminist. And the reason why I raise this is because how I came across your work was when me and my colleague, Moya Lothian-McLean, were talking about sexlessness, resentment, and desire. And we jokingly were like, oh, are you a femcel? And I was like, I don't think you are. And it was like that was the dog whistle for like all these people who identify as incels to be like, you vicious fucking bitches. Mm-hmm. And when I think about my experience as a kind of online lightning rod for people's hatred, whether that's based on race or whether that's based on gender, a lot of that comes from people who describe themselves as incels. And it's racialized and it's sexualized. And I wonder if that goes a really long way in shaping how media reports on incels, because if you are someone with a public-facing social media profile, mm-hmm. like a journalist or an influencer or some kind of public commentator, you've got a lot of people calling themselves incels saying that you should be raped and murdered.
Yeah, certainly. And the most extreme incels are the ones making the noise. So like, they've even done studies of the forum content, and the vast majority of any of it is produced by just 10% of accounts. So kind of like any group, the most extreme voices will be amplified. But you touched on a very important thing of why the resentment would be so channeled towards you. And I think there's a lot of failures of cross-sex mind reading on the part of incels. They see an attractive young woman as living life on easy mode. So this is the fact that and they really hate anyone describing themselves as femcel because they think that's impossible. There's no such thing. I often get asked this question of, is there such a thing as a female incel? And
wasn't the term coined by a woman?
Right, yes, in the late 1990s. And the community descended into toxicity. But initially, my thinking on this has evolved a little bit. Initially, I might have agreed with incels that, yes, there's no such thing as femcel in the same way. Most women could go out and get sex or a relationship if they wanted. It might not be the exact type of sex or relationship that they want, but they could get something. And for men, or for incels in particular, some is better than nothing. Some is better than none always. But as I thought about it further, and what I know about female sexual psychology, that's not the case. Like, I think a lot of women would way prefer to stay single and have none rather than settle for what they don't want. So it amounts to the same thing. So I do believe there can be femcels. But I would say that the frustrated female single person doesn't need a weird subculture community online, because the idea of where are all the good men gone is kind of a mainstream view, and it's kind of celebrated. It's kind of like, yeah, actually, there isn't enough good men out there. You see like New York Post articles saying like broke men are hurting American women's marriage prospects. And it's like a very different take. But I guess it's a lot more easy to be sympathetic to frustrated single women who are not finding men who measure up to their standards, because they're not threatening violence and they're not extreme, or their misandry is a little less aggressive than the misogyny from incels, for sure.
You use such an interesting phrase, which is cross-sex mind reading. Because everything you know has come from proper research. Everything I know has come from like my Reddit lurker account. But one of the things I've gleaned from my Reddit lurker account is that what incels say women want and what women I know want are really, really different. So you've got all these incels who are like, well, I'm never going to be 6'2". I'm not going to lie. Like, lots of women do find tall men attractive, but there is such a thing as team short and sexy.
Okay.
Right? There is such a thing.
I need to be aware of this because I'm pretty short myself. So I'm going to be.
You need to be on team short and sexy.
Hashtag team short and sexy.
Yeah,
Short King Spring. I've heard of that one.
Short King Spring. There's such a thing as Short King Spring. Kendrick Lamar being the sort of figurehead of Short King Spring.
Short, huh?
He's a short dude.
Ooh, yeah.
That's why one of Drake's disses was size 7 feet.
Okay.
How can you be big stepping in size 7 feet? So like things like height, but then also things like you've got to drive a nice car and you've got to earn loads of money. Now, maybe this is shaped by living in London. I've never heard a single woman say, I want a guy with a nice car, because who fucking drives in this city? Like, nobody.
Yeah.
And when it comes to income, it's not so much that my friends want someone who's got this really high income and can buy them loads of things, but they want someone with a sense of purpose and drive that matches their own, at the very least, and an education level that matches their own.
Yeah.
And when I was saying this online on Twitter, I was like, you know, what you guys seem to think women want and what my female friends are saying, it invoked this huge backlash where they were like, you lying bitch. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, if you're not going to believe women, I don't know what to do.
It's like that stems from their education about the mating market coming from online communities rather than actually engaging with real life. Like, it just takes 10 seconds to look around you and say, not every married man with kids is spectacularly handsome Chad, right? People manage to do it, right? So, but that incels describe women's mate preferences as LMS, looks, money, status. And we find that in our research. We published a paper in the Journal of Sex Research that found that incels, like you said, overestimate the importance of physical attractiveness and financial resources and underestimate the importance of kindness, intelligence, humor. And you might say, okay, fair enough. Maybe in that data, incels would say, oh yeah, well, women self-report bias or social desirability bias. We know, because we know in the literature that women do actually value financial resources quite a lot, actually. So you could make a case that maybe they're a little more accurate on that one, but there's loads of evidence that women value intelligence, kindness, and humor as well. So incels, I often describe that there's a nugget of truth to things that they say, but they are extreme in their analysis and extremely blunt and very focused on just one piece of the puzzle. And there's also kind of a sense that nothing is ever good enough for them. So, for example, there was one Twitter thread I remember where a former incel came in and said, I used to be incel, I'm short, 5'2" or 3" or whatever, and I'm now married with kids. You can escape this mindset. And incels just waded into it saying, oh, but she's probably cheating on you with Chad and using you for your money. And it's like, oh my God, if married with kids is not a win. So it's kind of like this extreme distrust of women. But I think from like a cross-sex mind reading kind of thing, I think culturally or as a society, we probably do underestimate how important I think physical attractiveness is more important than we let on, but it's not as the only thing that's important as incels say. So it's kind of like but if you completely act like incels are totally wrong in their analysis and looks don't matter at all to women or height doesn't matter at all, they feel gaslighted because it's so obvious that it does to some extent. So they're just extreme in their analysis. And I think this is very important in like any therapeutic alliance building with incels. You need to be seen as credible. So people who just say, oh, come on, it's looks aren't everything, you know, and it'll just happen for you one day. And that's really just not the case. Like that it's very, I think that's very disingenuous when people say to incels, oh, just take a shower, be a nice guy. That's all women want. And it's like, come on. You know?
Well, I mean, you used this phrase a couple of times, the dating marketplace and the mating marketplace. Mm-hmm. And the question that always emerges for me there is like, well, where is this dating and mating marketplace? Because I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but what dating is like on the apps and what dating is like in the club and what dating is like in a social milieu where it's friends and friends of friends, these are all different. And different behaviors, different characteristics are assigned different values in each of them. Like, I would ban the apps. I think that they are so bad. And I think that they're bad for happiness and self-worth. And I think they're bad for finding people you can really connect with. I would just get rid of them. And I have had exes who I've had very loving relationships with where I wouldn't have selected them on an app. But we fell in love and I was like feral for them and completely mad about how they looked and very physically attracted to them because of all these other qualities that made me physically attracted to them. And I perceived those qualities because we were part of a shared social milieu. So how important is the mediatization or the mediation of cross-sex contact here for like establishing what is valued and what isn't?
I think you've nailed it with the kind of bigger picture social analysis that there's an extreme atomization of dating culture now. It's very much funneled towards individually you are responsible for your own dating and just do it on the apps, right? And that is problematic for a number of reasons, including that it just prioritizes very static information. So, for example, it doesn't allow for a nice, charming Irish accent to compensate for being short.
You're right? Like doing like voice notes on the apps, like, please.
Literally, I was so thrilled when that came online on Hinge. I was like, yes, I put that front and center. But it would allow, so take me for an example, I'm about 5'7". There are probably a significant portion of women who are immediately filtering me out, right? And then I've met women in real life who say, you're not 5'7", you're taller than that, because they don't know, but they're filtering me out on the app, which is kind of annoying. So that extreme atomization, and you know, you talked about, in social milieu. So incels lack social milieu more broadly anyway. So you could conceptualize the incel problem as a broader disengagement from society, not just the focus on the sex. We tend to fixate on the sex bit because that's what they talk about most. But it is a broader loneliness problem. But culturally, bigger picture, there is a kind of that kind of social milieu blending. Can you meet someone at work is kind of frowned upon now. It's kind of like fraught with ambiguity. And that's it's kind of all funneling it towards the apps or you're on your own. And this is where maybe a lot of the resentment comes for incels, because even in recent decades, there used to be more of a clear-cut playbook of how to learn about the dating market. My father always tells me, well, you used to go to a dance and you asked a girl to dance and you asked, would she stay on? And it was very simple. There was a clear-cut rule book. There's no such thing like that anymore. And incels, there's extremely high rates of autism in the community. So you can imagine being a frustrated young man with autism, trying to learn about the dating market. You go to pickup artists to learn how it works. You try their crude tactics and it doesn't work. So you come to the black and white conclusion, I'm incel. There's actually data to show that there's a direct pipeline of pickup artist forums to incel forums. And I can imagine that for a young man with autism. We could do with making like dating a bit more of a group level, societal, social problem, because do people even set each other up on dates anymore? It's
I love setting my friends up.
Good for you. Good on you.
But that's because I'm a busybody. I'm like inherently a busybody. Mm-hmm. I've got a married couple under my belt. I introduced a couple who are now married.
Good track record. So my own grandfather was a matchmaker.
No way.
Yeah, in the west of Ireland. And my father always jokes that there was no incels allowed in his time. He didn't allow it. But there was this kind of social force of connecting people. And even if we think bigger picture ancestrally, over like about 70% of mateships were arranged by your kin. That doesn't happen at all. So this evolutionary novel, big city life, encountering the impression of theoretically unlimited amount of mates, which kind of makes you reluctant to commit to just one because you've got extreme FOMO. The apps are designed to keep you on the app, whatever they say about, we're designed to get you off the app. That's just a bad business model, right? So there's a lot of these social forces and this atomization and feeling like you're responsible for it on your own, that you can imagine that being hell for an autistic young man coming to the conclusion he's incel, right?
I mean, I think coming to the role of autism here, I was talking with a friend of mine who's a single straight guy, and he's not an incel, but he was talking about this extreme anxiety that he feels when he perceives women as a potential sexual relationship. And it's an anxiety that he doesn't feel around me because I'm his friend and I'm married, which puts me into the category of human. And the thing that I was saying to him, I was like, you know that women are people.
Yeah.
I was like, you know that we're people, and we're people the way you're a person. And, you know, doing this sort of like mad dance of like, oh, what's going to entice her is just such a nailed on way to come across as like inauthentic or a bit jarring or kind of creepy. And that's gonna be the thing that drives us away. And it's hard because you're asking straight men to do something contradictory, which is if you want to find a potential sexual connection, you have to stop treating every woman like she's a potential sexual connection.
Interesting. So I can just imagine incels listening to this now, and it is going to be clipped as rage fuel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they would see that as, that's a privilege that handsome men can do. They can be relaxed and let it happen and just be free and easy about it. And I do think they're kind of accurate in a way, like it doesn't just happen for incels, for unattractive young men, or perhaps even men, more than women might realize. Men have to be a bit more strategic about it. It doesn't really just happen. You kind of have to go out and get it, and you have to overcome the anxiety. You have to go through a lot of rejection, and men have the impression, but it's worth it. What's on the other side is worth it, I promise you. But incels come to the conclusion, no, it's not worth it. I don't get enough positive feedback. I try 99 times, fail 99 times. I'm not willing to try 100th time. If they take their mind off it and don't try at all, nothing happens. So again, you can see why they'd be frustrated. But yeah, this is interesting what you said about the opposite sex friendships as well. You might not like a lot of the data about men's motivations for opposite sex friendships.
Well, no, it's not that I think that these things are inherently like desexualized, because actually I think when you're becoming friends with someone, there is a kind of desire and a kind of eroticism and going, what is this thing? I feel drawn to you. Where is this going to go?
Yeah.
And that's maybe the bit I'm highlighting, which is when you are making friends with a woman or, you know, anyone's making friends with anyone, there is this sort of like, oh, what is this? Like a sense of magnetism. And you just can't smother it with intention straight away, because that's going to snuff out the little flame.
Yes, I guess that's right. And just kind of on a bigger picture, there is a corniness to pickup artistry. and like any kind of male self-development that you attach the goal of achieving romantic success to. But on the other hand, that's so intuitive to men. Like developing yourself and seeking status is largely driven by the prospect of getting sexually selected. That's like, men are insane status drivers for that very reason. But once you attach that goal, make that explicit of, oh, that's why you're doing it. And that might not be conscious for a lot of men, but it's going on. It becomes a little bit almost shrouded in misogynistic. It feels misogynistic. I'm thinking of Barack Obama, actually. He got in trouble in his autobiography. He wrote about reading different types of literature to impress different types of women in his university. He was like reading Marxist literature to impress such a one.
Oh yeah, that totally works on me. My husband's a communist.
No
like
way.
It really worked.
Okay, very good. But yeah, that is intuitive to young men. It's like, oh yeah, developing yourself and kind of being more intentional and trying to become more attractive. So I'm kind of not happy to cede the pickup artist territory to toxic misogynists. I really do think there is space for like a ethical pickup artistry, or like education about how you can develop yourself to be a more competent romantic partner, and you know, even at the level of school education. I would think we talk about sex education a lot. We don't talk about pre-sex education, like how to actually become an attractive partner. And you could have interventions in school that are very kind of benign, like, okay, we're going to learn how to make an effective dating app profile. You can imagine that would engage students, and you could say, oh, let's get the girl's perspective. I'm just thinking of some ideas.
I don't know. I'm so horrified by the apps, and I hated who I was on the apps. I hated the fact I was just swiping past these like hopeful faces, like at the camera. Like it felt cruel, and I didn't like doing it. I didn't like the way I was trying to boil myself down into a kind of commodity, like selecting pictures and thinking about what I wrote in a way which was, it was commodifying. And like, you know, my best friend who's on the apps, you know, she was showing me her profile, and I was like, this is you, and it's also not you.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. Like, you know, what are you doing on a Sunday morning? She was like, you know, oh, you know, I have a pistachio croissant and I do the NYT crossword. And I was like, you do that, but you're also like paralyzed with anxiety about work, just like the rest of us.
Yeah.
But even if you were to write that, yes, that would be a form of humor which is itself commodified.
So the app thing was just like an example of how it could be pretty benign. It needn't be like descend into toxicity.
I think that's my like trigger word is like apps. I'm like,
I don't think we're going to get rid of them though. So I think we need to maybe figure out how to make them work a bit better, or if that is the mating market, right? And I use the term mating market, and I've tried to find alternatives because people really bristle at the commodification of it, but it behaves like a market. People are valued for certain different traits, more or less. They compete in it to be chosen in it. It behaves like a market. And I'm at a loss for any better term. But my main point there was, I think we needn't let self-development for men with the goal of being a better partner and achieving romantic success automatically equate to misogyny. Because if you don't have anything to say on that very important thing to young men, Andrew Tate has plenty to say, and they will flock to him, right? So if you have to provide some sort of alternative.
Andrew Tate for me is so funny because he's held up as this image of what it means to be like a sexually successful man. And to me, and all the other straight women who I know, he looks like a greasy penis with ears and sunglasses on. Like, he's just not an attractive man. He talks really weird.
Yeah.
You know, he talks like a guy in the smoking area who has just done a rail of coke in the bathroom that you would in real life be like, get away.
Yes.
And yet he's held up as this thing which is aspirational. Can someone explain that to me?
So that's a good point, and that could be part of it in the education interventions. You could say, this is aspirational for young men for not crazy mysterious reasons. A kind of a playboy with Bugattis, millions of dollars, and loads of hot women around. You can understand why that's appealing to a young man who's like bursting with testosterone. He's kind of very short-term mating oriented. But you need to contrast that then with a vision of alternative mating success. Someone who has a flourishing long-term relationship, family life, and kids. But also, that's kind of also seen as a little bit trad and problematic too. So it's kind of like, what are we doing here? We have to kind of provide some sort of mating vision of mating goals, recognize that is important to young men, and contrast because the Andrew Tate and all that, it's very, very short-term mating oriented. It's kind of like this fast and loose kind of.
Or when they talk about the one that you wife and commit to, it's like she has to have a body count below blah blah blah. I'm like,
interestingly, we did some research to find that both men and women prefer a partner who has some sexual history rather than none. But it can get too much, right? So, but
why, right? Why is it considered too much? I think that there's a whole host of reasons kind of lumped in there, where one person might have a very puritanical view of it, of like, it's made you damaged goods and you've been somehow contaminated. And there might be another view where it's like, oh, that seemed like a kind of pathological behavior.
Yes, yeah. And look, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So from a purely mate guarding against infidelity, which is very strong selection pressure for men, they're very concerned about that. So it is something to be concerned about. I simultaneously think it's over-egged, but acting like someone's sexual history or previous behavior is of no relevance to you in your decision making doesn't sit right either. I think it is like, you can imagine, but what we find in research is actually it very much matters when that sexual history was. So did you have a crazy period in college or something, and then you had
Ho season.
Ho season, yes. You have great terminology for everything.
Please put this in your academic papers.
Sure,
I want it known as ho season.
Cite Ash Sarkar, ho season. Very good. But yeah, so it matters what your sexual history looked like in terms of temporally. Like, when did you have a series of failed relationships? Did you have you just suddenly gone off the rails and now you've had like 10 sexual partners in the last year? And before that, you had none. It very much matters to people. So.
I mean, going back to this idea of what is being modeled as an aspirational kind of relationship. And for me, it's less about going from promiscuity, short-term mating towards marriage and kids. And it's much more about things like commitment, seriousness, lack of disposability, not treating people as disposable, not being treated like you're disposable. And one of the things that comes up a lot on my podcast with Moya is the difference in disposition when you're early in a relationship versus when you've been together a few years. So at the start of my relationship with my partner, there was an element of me introducing an adversarial logic where I said, well, here are my standards and you've got to meet them, otherwise I'm out. And that was because I dealt with an awful lot of time wasters before. So I was like, these are the things that are important to me.
Yeah.
I'm dating for these things. And if they're not happening, I'm not dating. Now, we've been together 6 years, we're married. It's a lot more relational. And so it's about these sort of negotiations between our needs. There's a sort of temporal consideration involved. So you're going through a hard time. I'm going to cut you some slack. You're going to cut me some slack when I'm going through a hard time. It's a different logic. The thing which is absent from both the beginning and the end is this idea of a transactional relationship. And it seems to me that on the internet, whether it's incel culture or like pickup artists, or whether it's like kind of women on TikTok talking about like soft life or like, my love language is gifts. It's so transactional and it's poisoning everyone's brains.
Yeah, but again, I come back to it, like, unfortunately, and you might bristle at this, but like, mating is to a large extent transactional. You do have to offer benefit and make trade-offs with, people value different traits, and, you have to be able to demonstrate them. And that's why I think this vision changing of how do you teach young men to be someone that has lots to offer to a relationship? And that could be including of the ability to build healthy relationships like you just described with your partner.
Let's not go too far.
Okay, he's got costs as well. But no, that idea of like educate men is like, here's how you provide value, like be a high value man. That's what like pickup artists talk about, but they're just describing something very negative. Like you could actually have that conversation and say, here's how you become a guy who a lot of women would like as a husband. That seems like a lot more.
But I guess I object to that being called transactional, because I don't think that there are these like currencies that he possessed and I possess. That's one way of looking at it. And I think it would be so flattening of our dynamic, right?
I think that's interesting, because I have a pet hypothesis that the ultimate form of like mate retention, of kind of securing your relationship, feeling irreplaceable, is the idiosyncrasy. So like that we're weird, but in a very unique way that you could only ever get with me. And that's kind of how you...
I guess the thing that I would say is that rather than it being this like, you've got this currency, I've got this currency, and I'm sure that there are ways in which you could look at the relationship like that. But the way we would articulate it to each other, and what I believe to be true, it might be horseshit, what I believe to be true, is that it's a kind of like eudaimonia or flourishing, that we are like partners in helping each other flourish and be better in the world, better to each other, better to our families. Like that's our project. Yeah. And that's not so much about like, you do this, I do this, like, and one's conditional on the other.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you've evolved to kind of almost this oneness of seeing yourself as an entity in and of itself with shared goals. And that seems healthy.
But that's what I would be saying to people as like a model of a relationship has to move away from transactionality.
Sure, I agree. But I think there's things that if your husband started exhibiting negative traits, you'd suddenly lose interest in him. You quite rightly. Like if he suddenly became extremely lazy, any amount of things, you can imagine why you might say, hold on, you're not actually living up to your end of the bargain. But I guess it's just a bristling at the transactional nature of it, I guess. But I just ultimately think that you can learn about this stuff. I don't think like the dating market is as opaque as people kind of suggest. That really doesn't sit right with me when people kind of like, I just wonder when people bristle so much at the term mating market. I always wonder, how are they making their own mating decisions? Like completely arbitrarily? No, they have criteria that they value more or less, and they're looking for certain qualities. So I just ultimately I have this big belief that we can save pickup artistry from the toxic kind of world it's descended into, and I think that's important to do, because if you don't, the others will. I
guess I just think dating can be more or less marketized, and the advice that I often give to my friends who are single is get off the apps, develop your social milieu, do more things, bring yourself more into connection with a kind of community, and you will have different kinds of relationships. You'll be making judgments based on different things, and you'll be judged on different things. Yeah. And you'll be treated as less disposable.
I think that's important, yes, and cultivating a kind of a broader social milieu, definitely. But I'm reluctant to kind of let go of the app. So I think of a former colleague I had in my previous work, and she was desperate to meet someone, but she would work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, all day, and then go home on the train and sleep and come to work again. And she was saying, I will not go on the apps. And I'm like, where are you going to meet someone? On the train? Like that's your life. Like literally you're at work, you're on the train, or you're asleep. So, it's like it or lump it, the apps are kind of here to stay. I think we need to learn how to leverage them better. And the incentive structure of the apps is kind of maybe wrong as well.
It's an alienating experience. The swiping, the blue screens.
There could be things like a limit on how many swipes you get to do. Like, I don't know, I don't know how I'd incentivize them better.
But I don't know if you've had this experience in your own life, but for me, this is also the difference between like a real life space and the apps, right? When I was on the apps, I was like swiping by myself. I felt depressed. I felt like I was doing a depressing activity, and I felt very alienated. I felt alienated from my own desire because I was like, I'm just seeing pictures. This is not like, I'm not attracted to pictures.
Women's desire is very different. The men's very, very visual. So it's not an uncomfortable experience seeing hundreds of pretty women on an app isn't like,
well, I think maybe it would be uncomfortable if you think like this is a catalogue of things I can't have,
right? And if you were getting no positive feedback at all, and there is evidence that excessive swiping is bad for mental health, and that incels uniquely struggle on the apps. But again, I think men could all probably benefit from some coaching on how to make a better app profile. I think men are uniquely bad at it, according to my female friends. Anyway, they say.
Yeah, like lit from behind, sunglasses on. It's
yeah, and interestingly, sharing too much information from my own life now, but several dates I've been on have said, "Oh, you're way nicer in real life than on the app. You need to change." And I'm like, "Oh, damn! I thought I was doing pretty good.
I don't know.
I study this stuff for a living."
How can you how can you boil down a personality onto the app? But I think also separately is that apps, you're on the app when you're by yourself, right? So it's an isolating experience.
Yes.
Whereas I remember, this was 10 years ago now, I was fresh out of a breakup and I was out at a bar with some friends. And there was this dude who I thought was mega hot. And I remember being like, oh my God, I've just forgotten how to do this because I'm fresh out of a breakup. And so my male best friend coached me through it. He was like, you're going to do this. You're going to he's going to go out for a cigarette. And it went down exactly how he said it was going to go down.
I bet.
It went in one sense really well. In another sense, it went really badly because the dude, after we'd been flirting, exchanged numbers, he was like, by the way, I'm here with my girlfriend. And I was like, what the fuck, man?
So you touch on something very important. So I think a flipping of this gender norm of women still very much want to be pursued rather than having to pursue. You may be a bit of an exception to that, and it sounds like you were agentic, and I think that's great because it will invariably go well for a woman. So honestly, the worst you will get is a polite rejection and a rain check from a guy who has a girlfriend or something. Whereas men, if they approach a woman, it's often uncomfortable for the woman. They feel obliged to give too polite of a rejection, which men perceive as still interested. So it's all this massive failures.
Yeah, unless you pull the taser on them, they're like, I'm not hearing a no.
Right, exactly. And that's literally an evolved propensity for men to have an over-perception bias. Our ancestors weren't the ones who kind of thought, oh, I'm not sure if she's interested. They were the ones who saw a smile and thought, she's interested, right? It's a massive finding that men over-perceive sexual interest.
We're going to talk about whether this is evolutionary or not in a second.
Okay, interesting. But anyway, so I think the flipping of it, if you could encourage women to be more agentic about seeking out relationships that they want, that would be better because it would be less uncomfortable for everyone. Also, women have a lot of higher of sexual regret than men. Men regret the sexual opportunities they missed, whereas women often regret the sexual opportunities they were convinced into, except when they initiate them themselves. There's virtually no sexual regret then. So it would be a prophylactic against a lot of negative societal things like women's discomfort, women's fear, this kind of failure of cross-sex mind reading of signals of and it's a very dark finding as well, but a lot of women do report to have engaged in, what's it called, token resistance, where there's a viral video right now actually about this girl who said, oh, I was on a date with this guy and brought him back and said, I'm not going to sleep with you, and he just cuddled me and respected my boundaries. And I wonder, is he gay? And it's like, oh God, that to me is so corrosive. Terribly toxic thing to make a video on. But
so I do think there is such a thing as toxic femininity, right? I think that exists. And I think that how we as human beings internalize and make sense of all the really contradictory messages we get about gender and how you're supposed to perform your gender and how you're supposed to almost maximize your gender. No wonder it results in fucked up behaviors because it's a fucked up set of messages that we're getting. That's the first thing. But the second thing about, what do women have to fear from being agentic? We have to fear rape and murder. And that might be overly exaggerated in terms of how much it looms in our heads. But I was taught about sexual violence from before I can even remember being taught about it.
Yes.
And that being something which conditions my behavior. It's not just about fear of rejection. Of course, that's in there. It's what if I make the wrong choice?
Yes.
And this is why, coming back to, is this a sort of evolutionarily encoded thing or whether it's culture? It's that one, I think culture's so strong, I don't know how to separate myself from it and go, well, this is a biological response and this is a cultural one, right? I think these...
They needn't be different, by the way. Culture is a biological output. It's
Well,
produced by humans with brains.
Culture
doesn't descend upon humans from... It's not a magic.
It's not, right? There's social and cultural reproduction, right? Which is connected to biological reproduction, but it's not the exact same thing. I come back to something which Esther Perel said, which is, if the costs for men and women were the same, right, maybe you would see similar behaviors rather than really different ones. But my husband has never had to fear that he will be raped by someone who he goes home with in a way that me and my female friends have to.
Totally right. And that you kind of said it very perfectly. That's exactly where we expect to see psychological sex differences between men and women, is where there's fundamental biological differences. So given the stark asymmetries in risk of sexual violence, how costly sex is, it would be remarkable if evolution didn't also give us psychology to attend to those differences. So women fear sexual violence way more than men because it's way more costly and it's way more of a threat to them. So that, evolution not giving us psychological differences to attend to those reproductive or biological differences would be like evolution giving us a body for bipedal locomotion, but no inclination to walk. It just wouldn't happen. You get so humans solve the adaptive problem of getting food into your body the exact same way. Men and women solve it the same way, virtually no sex difference. Sex psychology, sex is such a different animal for women than for men that it would be remarkable if there isn't psychological differences. And the psychological differences we find are some of the largest in all of psychology. They're the equivalent in effect size to the difference in upper body strength between men and women. It's remarkably strong finding.
I mean, I'm not throwing evolution out of the window. I'm not like such a hardcore culturalist that I think that there's absolutely no impact of biological sex differences. I'm saying that I find it very, very difficult to identify where one ends and the other begins. And when it comes to how we're socialized into our gender, and so much being socialized into gender is being socialized into sexual behaviors as well, that is that is happening from the moment we are newborns and, our external reproductive organs are identified and, you're slapped with a blue baby grow or a pink one. That process of socialization starts first. And I think part of the reason why I think about the way in which I was socialized to think about sexuality so much is that I was raised by a single mom with a sister, and my mom worked in child protection. So she was very alert to, because her working life, she was exposed to the realities of sexual violence. And so she was thinking about, how do I raise daughters to be confident and independent and not puritanical about sex, but also one which is very, very risk aware. And that training, I can definitely see how that's impacted on my behaviors. And I think that's why I come back to again and again, how we are imprinted with our gender by our parents has such a massive impact on our sexual behaviors and our risk perception. Yeah.
So I don't know. I still think women would fear sexual violence even if you took away all the training about it. I think they would fear it way more than men anyway. But the fact that there is that cultural training speaks to the differentiated harms, the differentiated risk between men and women. Your parents or your mother was training you about that risk of sexual violence because it's accurate. It is a way bigger risk for a young woman versus a young man, and way more costly. So that culture is in response to, it's not just totally arbitrary. We couldn't just wake up in the morning and say, let's train men to be more fearful of sexual violence than women. That just wouldn't kind of work. The way it's described sometimes in the old field of sociobiology is that genes hold culture on a leash. That you can create culture, but you can't just create any sort of culture that's totally devoid. There's some things that just wouldn't work to try and create. But is it a bad thing that women are? I think maybe it can get excessive. So, for example, I'm thinking of this: would you prefer be in the woods with a man or a bear? Thought experiment that everyone is kind of acting like it's this profound thought experiment, but I have some issues with it.
Depends on the bear.
It depends on the bear, depends on the man, all of that, whatever. But I had this conversation with a female friend, and she said, well, logically, obviously a man, but it's an emotional response. And I was like, okay, I just don't think I'm excessively fearful because of my irrational emotions, and that is sufficient that I will discard men and liken them to beasts. I don't think that's that good, because I do think we have research that men actually underestimate how fearful and harmful sexual violence is to women to a realistic degree. So by these kind of irrational thought experiments, that's cover for men to go, oh yeah, when women talk about their fears, or they're as afraid of bears, like it's all kind of, it's not very rational. Whereas the fear is actually rational. And I think we should have a more accurate conversation about how calibrated that is, and kind of help men to understand the extent to which women do live in fear. But I just think it was just not very useful.
Have you read by Catherine Angel, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again?
No, I haven't. That sounds interesting, though.
It is such an incredible book. And one of the things she talks about is this modern condition in which heterosexual women in particular, but not only heterosexual women, are conditioned with two completely conflicted messages. One is, to be a self-actualized woman, you have to know what you want, you have to be in touch with your sexuality, you have to be good at articulating what you want, you should feel able and agentic to pursue it, and on the other hand, you're going to be raped and murdered, and you have to perpetually guard against it all the time. Yeah. And the idea that within that, you can somehow form a healthy sexual self is crazy.
It's tough.
Right?
For sure.
And I think that something is culturally flexible, because I don't think it's the same in every culture, and I don't think it's the same in every period in history, and I don't think it's the same in every context. This idea that to be a responsible woman, you have to be really, really fearful. And it's something which you see again and again reinforced on social media. I saw this TikTok of a woman, I think that she was advertising home security in secret, but it was in the guise of a real video, which is, my husband has left for a work trip, and she turns on all these security cameras and she bolts all the windows and doors, and she does everything apart from sit at the door with a crossbow. Yeah. And I was like, this is a very unhealthy message about womanhood that I'm receiving right now. And even when, I talk with female friends, because I really love walking by myself at night. I am cautious about where I do that. And because I'm a city girl, it's only places where there are other people walking. Whereas my country mouse partner is like, people at night, that's where the scary thing is. You should go to the field. I'm like, no. But like this idea of like, are you doing something reckless or are you doing something not reckless? That is culturally shaped about like, what does it mean to be a responsible woman? What's a responsible amount of fear to have?
But it is, you do need to strike a balance, because having no cultural messaging about women's greater risk than men's doesn't feel useful either. I think there is a excessive alarmism about women's fear, but that is to some extent adaptive. It's like an overly sensitive smoke alarm. It's our ancestors were the ones who were more fearful. They weren't the ones who were kind of reckless, so you do. But yeah, you're right. It is about striking a balance. But I wouldn't want, if I'm raising girls, I will be telling girls about kind of try to give them an accurate sense of the threat. But yeah, it can be dispiriting, I imagine, to think, encourage young women to live your life in fear. And I think that is overblown in the cultural messaging, but it is somewhat necessary too. I don't want a complete absence of any messaging on that. I think young women do need to be taught, okay, you
don't take the shortcut through the park at night.
Yeah, for sure. Just, you can't, there is a balance, but it's tricky. Yeah.
I mean, not to do the whole, have you read, but like, there's a really amazing novel by China Mieville called Perdido Street Station. And a subplot of it is trying to imagine a society and a culture in which rape happens and is taken seriously, but all of the cultural loading of rape and the idea of it contaminating you or devaluing you or making you, a social outcast or, you bearing the shame for what was done to you, trying to imagine a culture in which that happened. And I think that it's quite telling that you have to reach into sci-fi to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So again, coming back to this thing about as an evolutionary response, would I feel the fear so acutely if it wasn't laden with all of this cultural meaning that the shame is mine, that I'm devalued in some way? And there are examples of cultures that have tried to do things a bit differently. So after the 1971 War of Independence in Bangladesh, where rape was used as a weapon of war by the Pakistani army.
Often used in war, yeah.
As a culture trying to deal with the fact that so many women had been raped, and that the traditional mode of understanding it was that these women are, they've been soiled, they've been dirtied, was to try and turn them into images of patriotism, no, these are heroes of the nation, the way a soldier would be. So there are attempts to culturally reframe the meaning of rape.
Yeah, I do agree with you. So a paper was published from our lab called The Costs of Rape that talks about all these broader social costs, like you said, about the shame, the cost to social relationships, romantic relationships, all of that. We should make social efforts to try and reduce those. But I do think sexual violence is very heavily stigmatized for the perpetrator too. And unfortunately, sexual violence is a very difficult crime to prosecute. And I think actually because it's so difficult to prosecute and you don't often get justice in response, I think that we elevate our stigmatizing of the perpetrator. So even, I'll give an example. So I heard a talk from a guy who was cleared, exonerated. He was accused of rape, falsely accused, and was exonerated in the end. And I heard him talk, and I kind of, on one hand, I was thinking, oh, wow, what a terrible thing. That must have been so difficult and whatever, and I'm glad he got exonerated. But then on the other hand, there was still some part of me that was like,
did you do it?
Must have done something. I don't know. Yeah, even the mere accusation alone is enough to kind of destroy a lot of men socially. And I think, we are amplifying that. I think it is a massive social stigma, and rightly so, because it's so difficult to prosecute, unfortunately.
I mean, I know that we're also veering away from your precise area of research here, but I think it's important. Does this have something to do with the fact that you've got a legal standard of what is rape, right? And you've got certain defenses which are acceptable in a court of law. For instance, I had a reasonable belief that this person consented, even if they're saying that they didn't. And then you've got the experiential dimension, which is really, really different. So something might not meet the criminal standard of rape, but is a highly distressing experience of sex where maybe it didn't breach the legal boundary of consent, but you don't feel that you wanted what happened. And that is an area that culturally, socially, politically, we're trying to make sense of.
Yeah, for sure. And the kind of the blurred lines between what is criminal and what is just sexual misconduct. I mean, a kind of an example of that is the Aziz Ansari case, where you had this woman describing a horrible experience, but didn't quite feel like sexual violence in the same way, or certainly not criminal. But it is difficult. But again, this comes back to, I think it's so important to do the research on cross-sex mind reading and then try and bridge that divide. So men consistently underestimate how distressing sexual harassment, sexual violence, all of that is. So I think you can have education interventions to bridge that gap. And I think that's important.
I mean, we've been focusing mostly on heterosexual sex and relationships. And I'm interested in knowing, have you encountered gay and lesbian incels? Or is there a different sort of cultural script for making sense of sexlessness within the queer community?
So it's interesting because you can actually tell a lot about our evolved psychology by analyzing how it manifests in LGBT relationships. So I'll give an example. Gay men are typically very promiscuous with each other. We describe it as...
Or it's culturally acceptable in a way which is different, I think.
I don't think it's just the culture that's making the high levels of promiscuity among gay men. And, it's very heavily stigmatized for a long time as well. So the way we describe it is that it's in its undiluted form. So two male sexual psychologies encountering each other don't have to come to the compromise. So gay men have the type of sex with each other that straight men would have with heterosexual women if they could, but they can't because female choice is very choosy and they have to come to some sort of more optimal compromise of balance between the optimal for the two. Lesbian women don't have promiscuous sex with each other, but they're very big on commitment.
I don't know, man. You should meet the lesbians I know.
Maybe, but not comparative to gay men, for sure. Gay men, it's kind of this implicit understanding that I know what it's like to have a male sexual psychology, and there's an almost understanding that it can be meaningless. It's not, whatever. A lot of gay couples have open relationships and do them quite effectively because they kind of recognize that this sexual bit is kind of compartmentalized. So in terms of, just get back to the incel question, where this sexual psychology even manifests in the mate preferences. So gay men put a lot of emphasis on youth and physical attractiveness in their mate preferences. Lesbian women, less so. So they have similar mate preferences to heterosexual men, gay men have, except obviously fundamentally different in one very pointed area. But so to get to the incel question, the only gay incels I've encountered have been older gay men who suddenly feel frozen out of a mating market that prioritizes youth and physical attractiveness. So that's interesting, but it's understood. It's never been like systematically researched, but that's the ones that have come forward to me that have described it.
I mean, I suppose, there are certain things which are a part of the queer dating and sexual scene, which are becoming a bit more a part of the heterosexual dating and sexual scene in urban areas in particular, but like are a lot more prominent. So one is the way in which interactions take place on Grindr. You're seeing a little bit more of that on something like Field, but it's not quite as like undiluted, to use your words. Yeah. And the second, thinking about things like a club scene where there are blurry edges between a club night and a sex party, right? And that is becoming a more prominent part of heterosexual dating, but not nearly as common as it is for queer people, particularly in big cities. So when you're thinking about sexlessness within that context, I can see how that's very age prohibitive, because you've got to be like young enough to want to go to a club night where the good stuff only starts at 2 a.m. right? Like, I'm 32, I don't want to do that anymore.
And it can be very alienating for even just without the age thing. So I have gay male friends who are long-term mating oriented, which makes them an outlier in their community, and they find dating incredibly hard because they feel alienated from the promiscuity of gay male dating life. It's kind of like almost implicitly accepted that there's some level of this, so that it is alienating if you're atypical for your sex or sexuality.
But then, I don't want to deny that there's an attitude to promiscuity, particularly amongst gay men, which is less typical in the heterosexual dating scene, or is at least a bit more socially frowned upon. Is that because you've got like two guys flooded with testosterone, or is it because you have a sexual and dating scene where for, centuries it was excluded from marriage and commitment and living openly? You could only have sex in ways which were secretive and kind of underground, and connections had to be fleeting because, like a cop might literally come in.
Yes.
You didn't have a social script for,
for long-term mating.
Yeah, for long-term mating. Like, when me and my husband got married, our families are there, and, it wasn't that different from my brother's wedding to his husband, but it was on my mind that me and my husband were doing something that people in our families had done for centuries, that for my brother and his husband, that was the first generation in which that was happening. I
guess it's a testable hypothesis. We can see as homosexual relationships are destigmatized, which we're making extraordinary strides on, whether that promiscuity will go down. I bet it won't. I don't think it will. I think it's more likely that heterosexual relationships will relax into being more like queer relationships a little bit, but I still think you'll see very distinct sexual norms because of the nature of the sexualities and sexes of the people in those relationships.
I mean, is there a different emotional response to sexlessness amongst gay and lesbian people that you've observed? Or is there resentment, a sort of loathing of the object of desire, as well as a kind of urge to be close to it?
That's interesting. You do have some incels who say that they wish they didn't have such strong desire, typically ones who have physical disabilities. And very tragic to talk with them about, they describe it as like a curse that their family can't be understanding about. And that's kind of difficult. So there is this resentment at your own desire. Like, it would be no problem if you didn't have the desire. But the resentment kind of manifests the same. So the gay incel older gentlemen who've talked to me, they're bitter at the nature of the dating market. They're hostile that, why do these superficial people have such superficial preferences? That's very typical of incels as well. They say, women just want the attractive, rich guy. They're so superficial. It comes out the exact same way, kind of bitter about the nature of what they're excluded from.
And I guess this is where I want to come back to the question of misogyny in particular, and you saying that perceived low mate value is, a kind of indicator of misogyny. And I suppose the thing that leaps to my mind is misogyny that occurs within relationships, which maybe isn't as visible because it's occurring within a relationship.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point, because, and also just related to that, the threat of violence towards women, insecure, jealous partners, way more threatening to women than sexless incels who they may or may not encounter. But the misogyny within relationships, it kind of functions similarly, I think. So misogyny within the context of a relationship, why do people insult their partners? That's when you're trying to lower your own partner's mate value and self-esteem so she's less likely to leave you. You hear abusive men say things like, who would have you except me? Look at you, who would have you except me? That's clear indicator I'm trying to not let you know you could leave. And it's a kind of a shady thing. It's a weird concept to wrap your head around. You want to lower your own partner's mate value. But it makes sense basically we describe it as mate retention behavior. And there's two types of strategies for mate retention. You can choose
cooking.
Well, a benefit provision, right? So one is you provide so many benefits to your partner that she doesn't want to leave you. The other, if you don't have much benefit to provide, if you're lower mate value and there's a discrepancy, you have to a cost-inflicting mate retention strategy. And this dark finding is that this manifests in status mismatch couples. So there's enormous new data from 27 EU countries that when women are higher educated or earn more than their partners, it's a massive predictor of intimate partner violence. So that's that manifesting. It's suddenly I need to, I'm at risk of losing her. I need to lower her sense of self-esteem, which is really dark. One white pill on that data is that it doesn't apply to men who enter willingly into a relationship with someone who's out earning them at the beginning. So it's when it flips that's a risk factor. But
that's so interesting.
Just to get back to the incel misogyny, I describe that as that cost-inflicting strategy from outside the confines of a relationship. So Jim Morrison from The Doors, he says, women seem wicked when you're unwanted. That just gets at it for me. That's exactly how it manifests. And then this becomes a cycle because, as I understand it, women don't typically like to date misogynists.
Love me, you hateful bitch.
Right,
and you're what?
So it creates more rejection, more resentment, lower mate value. It's this cycle, a bidirectional effect. Similar with the mental health. It's hard to get a partner when you're in poor mental health, but not getting a partner lowers your mental health. So there's bidirectional effects with all of this. And it's kind of becoming a little bit of an argument in the incel field, or research field, as small as it is. Some of us want to focus primarily on the mental health and improving their mate value. And in doing so, we think that we'll reduce the misogyny, which again, we see it as all tied up together. And there is another camp that kind of almost sees the causal arrow as just running from misogyny out. And it's I don't know, so mental health looks ugly sometimes. Our poor mental health looks really ugly. So it's, I think intervening at that level, if it has the benefit of reducing misogyny, I think it's worth doing. But I think there's some people that find the misogyny so abhorrent that it's almost like they don't want to help. They just want to say, demarcate incels as examples of bad behavior and endless analysis pointing at them saying how bad it is.
I mean, I think my approach is a little from column A and a little from column B.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose the bit which I think of is very political or like shaped by the conditions in which relationships happen.
Mm-hmm.
Before my grandma died, I remember very, very clearly an evening where it was me, her, and my mum sat around the kitchen table and we were having like some glasses of wine and we were chatting. And I realized that when my grandma had her first child, she was 19. Abortion was illegal. She couldn't get contraceptives. Same-sex relationships were outlawed. She wouldn't have been able to get a mortgage or open a bank account by herself.
Mm-hmm.
The conditions around her relationship with my grandfather, completely different. My mum, comes of age, matures into, being a woman. Abortion is legal. Same-sex relationships are legal, but highly, highly stigmatized. And contraceptives are available only if you're married or engaged.
Mm-hmm.
Me, I come to sexual maturity. They are practically flinging condoms at us in assembly,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like they're just like,
yes.
Pregnancy can and will happen to anyone. Like
Yes.
get on the pill.
Yeah, interesting.
I don't even have to be straight if I don't want to be.
Yeah.
I can basically get an abortion on demand below 24 weeks.
Not in Texas.
Not in Texas, but in Enfield, my friend.
Good. Yeah.
You had the sexual health clinic behind the big Tesco's.
Mm-hmm.
So, you could get condoms and a sausage roll in the same trip. Phenomenal.
Okay.
The context in which we were all making sexual and romantic choices in the space of those 3 generations, completely unrecognizable. And it doesn't just have to be about choosing a mate. It's also about choosing to have children.
Yeah.
For my grandmother, the norm was you had children, you had to work really hard not to have children.
Mm-hmm.
For my generation, the norm is you don't have children, you have to work really hard to make the choice to have a child.
Yeah.
It's not surprising to me that men haven't caught up with all of those changes occurring within the space of a few decades, when for centuries, women didn't have much of a choice.
That's right. And it might be an uncomfortable truth that for centuries, women were settling with men that they didn't ultimately desire just out of strict social norms or economic necessity. If you take those things away, maybe women will increasingly... So I'd categorize it as modern men are competing with other men for women, other women increasingly for women, and singlehood. So singlehood is being championed by corporate giants big time. Morgan Stanley has this big paper called The Rise of the She-Economy, where they predict that most women will be single and childless by 2040. And it's kind of this idea of be a girl boss, prioritize your career, is kind of championed.
It's the 4 no's in South Korea, isn't it?
Yes.
No kids, no dating, no marriage.
Yeah.
No sex.
Now, it's interesting because you could say, oh, well, if women don't need men for protection and for resources anymore, then they need the men like a fish needs a bicycle. So yeah, go and prioritize your career. But there's an endemic of unwanted childlessness among women. And this is not me saying William Costello is concerned about childlessness. I am concerned about fertility collapse all around the world, whatever. But this is by women's own desires that they are having fewer children than they want. And they have massive rates of unwanted childlessness. So 50% of women who don't have a child at the age of 30 will never go on to have one. That is stark.
That better be a promise.
Right. Well, yeah, but that is by women's own desires. They're having fewer. And I think that there's all sorts of initiatives you could maybe get into to help women not have to choose between career and a family. Maybe subsidizing egg freezing for younger women and making that a total just whatever your relationship status, just everyone does it, and pump research funding into making it work more effectively, making it more affordable. Because the number one reason why women freeze their eggs, there was the world's biggest study on why they do it. I was unable to find an eligible partner who would commit to me. So it's like, it kind of typifies that problem of women suddenly they're up against a lot. They have to get it all wrapped up in a neat little bow against a clock. And that's tough if you're prioritizing your career right up until the age of 30 and then suddenly trying to do it all.
Well, yeah, I say that those material conditions are so important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is women entered the labor market and the expectation is you can work like a man, but you're supposed to do all of the kinds of reproductive labor that women do, which is much more time limited. So the things that I would say could change that are things like universal basic income, lifelong adult education.
Yeah.
So
totally agree.
I went to uni between 18 and 22, right? I was studying like during those years. The idea of having a kid felt irresponsible. Like another reason why, fertility rates are going down is no more teenage pregnancy. That was a very successful policy aim.
And just the technology of the pill being so fundamental, it might be another uncomfortable truth that a lot of us may be accidents. There might have been no fertility crisis because, people just didn't, it happened.
I've always had the feeling that this personality doesn't happen on purpose.
Okay.
I'm like, yeah.
a happy accident then. But yeah, it's an issue. And I'm kind of annoyed at how any concerns about the fertility crisis or unwanted childlessness get seen as a kind of a right-wing kind of thing. And for me, it's just like an anti-humanist kind of perspective. I don't know. I like it, to be concerned about that feels very humanist.
But
like
you
it's
can't,
women's own desires. It's not like draconian Handmaid's Tale, me saying women should be having children. It's women who want children should be able to. That's my stance.
you can't be surprised that it's perceived as a right-wing thing.
Elon.
When you've got like kind of billionaire creeps like Elon Musk, where you're just like, oh, like you kind of get the feeling he like secretes sperm through his skin or something. Like it just more like, you've got that on one side. And you also have people talking about the fertility crisis as too much choice for women. Now, I agree, when you give women more choices, the kind of reproduction that was happening because there was a lot of social coercion is going to go down. For me, then the challenge is, well, how do you create a different kind of environment where having children is economically possible, which is increasingly not the case, and also aspirational in terms of your own happiness, that you don't have to have experienced all this freedom as a woman, and then you go, all right, I'm going to make myself incredibly vulnerable and incredibly chained to the home because that's the only way to do this thing. Yeah,
no, totally agree. And again, just to reiterate, my concern is on kind of lowering the unwanted childlessness, that rather than just saying, oh, women need to go and have more kids, but create conditions whereby women who want to have kids can have them and don't have to sacrifice their career goals. It's very difficult. My mother gives the advice. She says, women can have it all, but not at the same time. And it's a very important point. It's like you're up against this clock and you have to kind of organize your life very strategically. But yeah, I think, again, even just an educational intervention, I talk to women and they say, oh, I didn't even think about this stuff until at least I turned 30. And if you go by the stat of 30% of women who don't have a child at age, or 50% of women who don't have a child at age 30 will never have one, that's already too late. So it's like, maybe have those conversations and create a social norm where maybe the egg freezing is the norm. That means they won't, because for pregnancy viability, it's the age of the egg that matters, not the age of the woman.
Well, I was going to say that I can just about picture if lots of things had been very different. That maybe not me, because I just think I don't want kids, but like some of my friends at the age of 20 or 21 would be like, yeah, I want to do this thing.
Yes.
I can't imagine them thinking that I want to have a kid with a man who's 20 or 21.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And
that is not an attractive prospect.
But that's the point. It should become a social norm that whatever your relationship status, you don't have to use these frozen eggs until you need them, whatever. But you have the best chance at age 25 to get the most, to have your reproductive goals, have as many reproductive goals available to you. That's what I would say, that a social norm that was introduced for young women to do that.
I mean, I want to sort of draw what has been a very wide-ranging interview to a kind of close. And I suppose my penultimate question first is, you've talked a lot about what it means to make a man a more attractive sexual and romantic prospect. What does go into that, in your view?
So, historically, women selected men for provisioning her and her offspring with resources to help her overcome what we describe as the hostile forces of nature. That's what Charles Darwin said. We're always striving to overcome the hostile forces of nature. And throughout ancestral history, women needed men's resource provisioning for that. So that was a big one. That's not as salient anymore, although women still prefer a mate with who will do that. I'm
not sure if it's quite. I don't want a man who's going to live off my money.
Right. Okay. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And that is slightly different.
Mhm.
It's a feeling of, I don't want to have to be your mother and your lover and the person who's working while you do fuck all.
Who would,
Whereas
yeah.
a man who's like, okay, what I'm going to do is all of the domestic labor and you earn. I'm like, that's kind of I get that.
I wish a lot more women shared that sentiment and we could have a make stay-at-home dads sexy kind of movement. I think that would be good. But I don't think that that's what women
The sluttiest thing a man can do is wear a papoose.
Maybe, yeah, that'd be good. And again, maybe that this is a direction of travel with the rap music derogating fathering qualities and things like that. I would like to champion stay-at-home dads as kind of high status. But women make their mate choices as well around status. So which man is valued by his society or by our niche community or whatever, who is considered valuable to the people around him in his milieu. Historically depended on men for protection. That's not as salient anymore. You know, when like
you guys are all going to the gym, you told me.
Right. Well, that's just...
Who are you preparing to fight?
Interestingly, men overestimate how muscly women want men to be.
Oh yeah, there's a certain amount of veiny where you're like, oh.
Yeah, it's more for the other men. I think it's gonna we consistently overestimate that, but that increasingly prioritizing physical attractiveness is kind of a response to women prioritizing that in their mate preferences a little bit more over the recent decades. So it's kind of in flux. So that historical idea of women choosing men for like resources, that still is a strong mate preference, but increasingly women are beginning to mate down. Like they will marry men who are lower educated than themselves or earn less than themselves. But in those status mismatch relationships, we've talked about the domestic violence threat. There's also greater evidence of increased risk of depression, anxiety, infidelity for both sexes, erectile dysfunction, insomnia, weirdly. So a whole slew of discomfort. So it kind of suggests that this rapidly changing norm is kind of not being as well received as maybe we might think. Also, the great job we've done of getting women into the labor market by focusing on a brain-based economy, which women are amazing at. We haven't done a great job of making it high status to get men into the home. And I just don't know if men are personality-wise inclined to ever actually become interested in doing that. And if there is any hope in getting men interested to do that, it will be if it becomes high status in women's mate preferences. So the way we describe it is the mind of one sex shapes the body and mind of the other. So men are very responsive to what women reward. So if suddenly, like I said it kind of tongue in cheek about the make stay-at-home dad sexy movement, but if that did, and you can assign status to anything, like there's island communities that assign status to the guy who can grow the biggest yam. Like that's the big high status thing to do.
Oh my God, give me his number.
Right, yeah, hot, right? But so you could theoretically create a world. That's where we are culturally flexible around status. You could see a world where the most effective stay-at-home dad is considered high status, but specifically to women, that would be very motivating for men.
I think maybe there's something which was missing from that, which is a feminized trait, which when present in men is mad attractive,
interesting.
Which is an ability to read people.
Okay.
Which is when I see a man who is very socially attuned and very attuned to like little shifts in mood and can anticipate that and meet some of those social needs, I'm like, oh my God, that's the most attractive thing in the world.
Yeah, so control over your environment is always considered very attractive. It's why the holiday romance is always very attractive to women in erotic literature. So the idea is you've arrived on this island, you don't really know what's what, but the guy who is the high status scuba diver seems to know everything about this island. That's a good romance, right? It's like suddenly I'm in this new environment. That guy has control over this environment.
But not just
but so social adeptness is very important in the modern environment.
Yeah, but it's not just social adeptness like control. Like it's and the reason why I present it as like a feminized trait, which is one which I really, really recognize amongst my female friends, and I recognize amongst some of the men in my life, but also quite like obviously not in others, which is a sort of attunedness to the people around them. Yeah. And a sensitivity to mood.
For sure. And that is a more feminized trait. And we could perhaps champion that as if more men were made aware of how attractive that is to women, they would be motivated to develop
mega
those skills.
hot. It is mega hot.
Listen up, guys. You heard it here first.
And I guess the last thing that I wanted to ask you, and this is a bit of, I guess, like content crossover. So as I mentioned, me and Moya have a podcast called If I Speak, where we address audience dilemmas as part of it.
Okay.
One of the dilemmas that we received was this. Now, we gave our own advice to it, but I also was interested in what you might say. The dilemma goes like this. Dear If I Speak, now dear Downstream, I feel a bit awkward putting my dilemma to you. Essentially, I'm an incel. I'm in my mid-30s and have never had vaginal sex. My sexual experience is limited to receiving oral sex in the past. I don't think I'll ever have a relationship. I don't consider myself socially incompetent. I have lots of friends and think I'm perceived to be quite a social person. However, for some reason, I seem incapable of developing the types of relationships that other people have. I've spoken to a therapist about it, and I don't feel confident that I will be able to change this situation. I don't actually feel lonely at all. I just worry that I'm not having the full/normal human experience. And it was signed off with a male name.
Yeah.
So what would you say?
I would speak to some research that maybe I haven't talked about. There's another perspective, a researcher called Bella De Paulo, who kind of is championing singles flourishing. And increasingly, that is something that we're seeing, that a certain type of person is flourishing in single life. And it seems like that texter seems a bit resistant to that idea. They feel like there's this pressure. And, you know, there is status afforded to people in their relationships. Your relationship partner can function to up your status. And even for men, especially, being sexually selected is an indicator of status. So we could maybe champion a healthy attitude towards single life, because like that texter said, it doesn't necessarily feel, or they don't feel lonely, but they just feel like they're missing out on something. And what they probably mean maybe is the status that other people see them as lesser, because it's like, oh, wasn't able to attract someone, why are they single? There is kind of aspersions cast on single people, I guess, that we could destigmatize singlehood, healthy singlehood, a bit more. It made me also think of incels often talk about irretrievably having missed out on youthful romance. So they kind of have this like golden attitude of like late teens, early 20s romance is like magical and it never feels the same after that. And
it gets better, man. It gets so much better.
It gets better, right? Yeah. But they kind of are convinced that even if they were to, I often ask incels in my qualitative interviews with them, how would you know you're no longer an incel? What would have to change? One girlfriend, sex one time, what would have to change? And they all talk about it like it's alcoholism, like a relapse could happen. Like I could always go back. And then that makes me think like it really is this mindset. It's a discomfort with your incel status and kind of how you are perceived in romantic relationships or the prospect of them. But yeah, difficult one. But yeah, I think that championing a healthier singlehood as not being automatically seen as low status would be a good social kind of movement we could have there.
Well, that seems like really good advice. William Costello, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.